So between filming these segments, I found something wrong with my shocked matchless. I'm gonna have to switch to my Kromsky Minstrel, but it's no problem. It's still a double drive wheel and nothing's really changed. My wheel is brand new. So in a way, we're kind of gonna be learning together because I have spun on a Minstrel once before. So the first thing you're gonna need to do if your wheel is brand new is you will need to tie a leader on your bobbin. And I have a tip for this. Some people use tape. You do not need to use tape, and I don't want anything sticky near my wool or my yarn or really on my wheel, so I don't use one. I'm going to show you the secret so you never have to. This is the bobbin for my Kromsky, and I'm going to use a piece of waste yarn. I'm also going to be using this yarn in the next lesson, but we need to do this first. So the secret is if you just tie one loop around your bobbin, it'll slip really easily, and it's supposed to, right? So that's okay. But it's because when you tie, there's always a certain tiny amount of slack in that knot. There's a way to spread that slack out. So if you go around your bobbin 3 or 4 times, these bobbins are really slippery, so I'm gonna go around 4 times. That will spread the same amount of slack out over 4 times around, and it will not slip. You can see if I'm trying really hard to make it slip right now, and I cannot slip around this bobbin. I'm gonna cut about 2 feet-ish away from my bobbin. Then I'm just gonna tie the 2 ends in a square knot. Then I'm gonna tie these 2 ends in a square knot, and I learned a square knot in Girl Scouts, so I always have to tell myself how it goes. Right over left, and then left, over right. So now I have the square knot, and you can see even though I'm trying to twist it around this bobbin, I can't do it. This is a way to do it without using any tape. I really don't recommend you put tape on your wheel or your bobbins. So I'm gonna cut most of this tail off, and I'm gonna put this on my wheel. I'm also going to direct you down at my wheel now so that you can see what I'm doing. I will just keep talking through what I'm doing with my wheel. So I'm going to take my bobbin, and I want to use my bobbin on a lower speed. So for a double drive wheel, that means you would pick a larger circle on the end. You can see on these bobbins, they're double-ended. There's a smaller on this end, a bigger on this one. We want the bigger one because that'll help us go more slowly. And I have my larger whirl, and that will also help us go more slowly. The smaller end of your bobbin or the smaller whirl goes faster and faster. Your whirl might just slide on or snap on, but this whirl has to screw on. So put my drive band on. I have literally never spun on this wheel before. This is like brand new moment. And drop this down a little. There we go. Okay, my drive band in the double drive configuration will go over the end of my bobbin and my whirl. It will only go over one place if you're using a single drive wheel. That's why we talked about learning about your wheel, so you'll know how it should be, right? Because of course you learned about your wheel. Now, in order to start, first I'm taking the end of my leader and I'm going to make a loop. So I've made a loop with it. I'm going to just tie a knot in that loop. So I'll take the loop behind the 2 ends and go through. So now the end of my leader has a small loop on it. I just find that to be very helpful. I think it's just easier for a beginner. Your wheel probably came with a hook called an orifice hook. They all look a little different. There's a bend in this one, and the reason for the bend is that I'm gonna go in through the orifice, and yes, this is called an orifice, and up and out here. I'm going to catch my leader on a hook and then catch it on the orifice hook and pull it through. Now we are ready to use some yarn. If you recall at the beginning of the class, I said you would need some commercially spun yarn to practice with. This is just a leftover from a project, and I would suggest that you use something that you can spin from the center. And I already have my center end coming out of this ball. You can see right here. So I can go on and on and on coming out of this ball. One of the reasons we're going to do this is that I see people who are new spinners do a couple of the same things frequently. And one of them is hold onto the wool too long without feeding it into the wool. Your goal is to kind of come into a rhythm where you can feed the wool into your wheel, getting the right amount of twist so it doesn't drift apart, but also so it's not way too twisted. So that's one thing you're going to practice with this, is you're just going to practice getting into a rhythm, feeding this into your wheel instead of holding on to it too long while it gathers twist. So again, I'm taking from the center of this ball of yarn. I'm just going to set it in my lap. And I'm going to use the loop on my leader to loop this through. I will do the same thing when I'm starting to spin my first single. So this is going to help you build muscle memory, and then the very next step we're going to use some spinning wool. Generally, this is not always true, but to start out, and a lot of times, you will spin your single clockwise. So we're going to start with clockwise, then we will also do some counterclockwise. Your leader should be tugging slightly as you spin your wheel. If it feels like it's tugging more than slightly, if it feels like it's pulling anything out of your hand, drop your tension down. That means ease your brake up a little bit, make your brake a little looser, or if you have a double drive, drop your flyer down a little bit. If it is not tugging a little bit at all, it's not tugging and it just feels like it's just hanging in your hands, you actually need to, if you have a double drive, raise your flyer a little bit, tighten your flyer a little bit, or tighten your brake a little bit if you have a single drive. This is actually just perfect. You can see it's going into the wheel, but it's not pulling out of my hands. And start practicing just getting a rhythm, spinning your wheel and feeding in the yarn. So do this until you really feel comfortable, and also this is going to give you a good feel for tension. Again, it should not feel like it is pulling against your hands, but when you reach your hand toward it, it should feed onto your bobbin. After a little while, you do need to switch your hook. So I'm just switching to the second hook. I started out on my first one, and I'm just going to keep going. Practice this until you feel really comfortable with this. And also, it's not a bad thing to hold on to it and watch the twist build up. You'll be able to see when things get over twisted, under twisted. All those things are really useful for you to know and understand. And when you're done, maybe you fill up a whole bobbin, maybe even more than one bobbin. That's really up to you, but you need to feel physically comfortable with what you're doing with your hands and your feet at the same time. After you finish that, start a new bobbin or empty this bobbin, start again, and go the other way. Generally, if you've spun your single clockwise, you'll then ply your yarn counterclockwise. So take 2 or 3 or more singles and make a yarn out of it. You can see actually that this yarn, I think, is 3 or 4 ply. It's a 4-ply yarn. So you would take 4 plies to make this and spin them all together counterclockwise. There are some exceptions to that, but for starting out, you'll get to that later. Make sure that you feel comfortable with your hands and your feet starting your wheel and getting your wheel spinning in both directions. And then when we come back, we're finally going to spin some wool.